creating a work tracker in Excel. This is the third session, pivot tables, charts, and building a dashboard. So what have we looked at so far? In the first session, we just built the foundation of our work tracker. So we essentially configured the data inputs. We looked at things like data validation, creating a table. In the last session we looked at a couple of weeks ago, we looked at adding functions and analysis. So we were looking at sum ifs, count if and count ifs, and we were also looking at things like conditional formatting, so that when we're looking at our work tracker we can easily see things like when something's overdue or when something's been completed. And today we are looking at pivot tables, charts, and building a dashboard. So last week, like I said, we looked at those functions. We looked at XLOOKUP as well, didn't we? So we looked at using XLOOKUP to assist with data validation. So if a user enters something into a cell, XLOOKUP is automatically going and searching for the related category and popping that into the next cell for us. And conditional formatting, which you can see briefly in place there. So we've got things like automatic red fill on those overdue tasks, and we've got things like the grey fill along those completed tasks. Objectives for today: we want to actually create the dashboard. So that's something that we said right at the beginning we wanted to do. We don't just want this kind of just table of raw data. We want actually to produce something. We want this live dashboard that users can go in and have a look at. So the first thing is just kind of configuring that, making sure that it looks nice. So we're going to be formatting some text and cells. We're then going to be putting some charts onto there. So we're going to look at creating kind of your regular charts within Excel, and then we'll also look at creating pivot tables and then pivot charts from those pivot tables. And we'll talk about what the difference is between a regular chart and a pivot chart, and how to decide which one you would like to see within your dashboard, or perhaps a mix of both of those. We're also going to talk about what to do once you've finished. So we've finished our tracker table, we've finished our dashboard, and now we want to share it with users. So we're going to talk about what we would do before we do that. So applying worksheet and workbook protection to prevent unwanted edits. We don't want people going in there and, changing the headers or deleting a chart or, editing, changing the pivot table for everyone. We want to make sure that we lock down those cells. We don't want people editing. And then finally, we're going to pop back into the presentation and we're going to talk about, is Excel actually the best way of kind of creating this work tracker? Are there other options? And if we're looking at other types of Excel files, so maybe other trackers or other shared workbooks, are there other solutions within Microsoft 365 that perhaps may offer kind of a better solution? So we'll look at kind of advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so lots to cover. I just come into my Excel file. So this is our Excel file from last week. We've got our work log on here. We've got a worksheet, which is our XLOOKUP table, which is used on the work log. We've got our lookups worksheet, which we're using for our data validation, our drop downs, and we've got our very empty dashboard. I have just taken a few minutes this morning to just move some things around because I just wanted to make sure that I had everything in the correct rows and columns, because I don't think you want to sit here for 20 minutes while I change the size of individual rows and columns. So all I've done, I haven't done any kind of calculations or anything. It's everything that we did last time. I've just added a title in there, and all of those calculations that we did in the last webinar. So total tasks, I've just moved the results into the cells. This is everything that we looked at previously. Okay, what I'm going to do just to make it a little bit more visually appealing is I am going to merge and center some of these cells. So I'm just selecting these cells and we're using merge and center. So that merges all of those cells into a single cell and centers the text in the middle. I can also change the vertical alignment as well. So rather than this text sitting at the bottom, we'll just pop that in the middle. I'm going to change the fill color. And remember, in the first session we set up our theme colors, and because of that I've got the Kiss Purple readily available to me, which is going to be really useful today. I'm going to change my text to white just so we can see it, and we're going to make it bold and a bit bigger. Okay, so something like that. Obviously, what your dashboard looks like is personal preference. You might hate the way I'm doing it, but we're just going to quickly run through, and I'm just going to do exactly the same with these cells underneath. So we're merging the cells, we're merging those cells, and we're doing a purple fill, white text, maybe making them bold, and then maybe making these numbers a little bit bigger as well, something like that. Okay, like I said this morning, I've already gone in and changed the width of these so that they've got kind of nice even spaces between each of these once I finished it. If you're interested in doing that, obviously you can just click and drag, but it's quite fiddly to get them exactly right. So what you'll be looking at is this one here, format, and then column width, or row height if you're looking at your rows, and then you can type in an exact value. And what I did is selected multiple. So for example, for all the gaps, I just hold Control, and you can select multiple, and then go into column width and put in 4.25 I used, and then it just makes them all the same. So that might be worth taking a look at, but I didn't want you to sit here and watch me do all of that. So I'll quickly do these. Just remember as well, with this percent completed, we do need to format that as a percentage. So we looked at number formatting in the first session. So I'm literally just selecting the cell and clicking that percent option. And again, we'll just make that bold and a bit bigger. This isn't going to be perfect because I'm obviously just quickly rushing through it, but hopefully you get the idea. There we go, something like that. Okay, so we've got a bit of a start. We've got some key statistics along the top. And as I mentioned last time, obviously we're using functions in Excel, so they're going to automatically update. Any changes in our table will be reflected in these figures here. So what I want in the dashboard as well is some charts. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, we do have options with charts. We have the built-in charts within Excel, or we have the ability to create pivot charts. So let's have a look at the built-in charts to start with. So I'm going to go to Insert. I've just clicked anywhere within my table of data here, and I can choose a chart type, or I can click on Recommended Charts, and it will bring up a list of charts that it's recommending based on the data that I have. Now, some of these first few recommended charts are actually going to look really interesting. So things like the sum of, maybe not that one, maybe not adding up the ID number, let's have a look at one. Sum of days remaining by status, for example. So that's how many days are remaining for all of the statuses that we have. So we've got complete, in progress, not started. Count of tasks by priority, that's quite a nice one. So how many tasks have we got that are high priority, low priority, and medium priority? Now those look quite good, and if I click OK, you'll notice actually that's not a standard chart, that is a pivot chart. So some of those charts that we have in that recommended list are actually pivot charts. And now that can be really, really helpful, particularly if you're not particularly confident with creating pivot tables or creating pivot charts, because it can just create that for you. It's created a new worksheet, it's created the pivot table, and it's created the pivot chart for me, which of course I can just cut and paste into my dashboard. Okay, so that is one option, but I'm just going to delete that for now because I'll show you how to create them from scratch in a minute. Those are the first few charts that I have, these ones at the top here. Then you'll notice the chart starts to get a little bit strange looking and not as useful. These ones here are your standard Excel charts. So if I inserted one of these, there's no pivot table, it's not a pivot chart, it's a normal Excel chart. And normal Excel charts from a table like this often aren't particularly useful because, as you can see from this one, it's taking every individual row, and I don't even know what this is showing. It's showing like estimated hours versus actual hours. It's unreadable. Okay, so if we were looking to create a chart from this data, really we either need to use a pivot chart or we need to create a chart from functions. So what we could do, if I come across, I'm just going to pop this over here so we can see it. Of course, I could put this in a new worksheet, but I'm just going to pop it here so we can see it at the same time. Let's say I wanted to create a chart based on, let's use status, for example. So we have not started, in progress, and complete. Now, we can actually use the functions that we looked at last week, the COUNTIF. So equals COUNTIF, and our range will be our status column. And remember, because we formatted this as a table, it's picking up those existing rows, but if any new rows are added or a row is removed, it will automatically update because it's looking at the whole of that column, however big that column is. And then the criteria is going to be, I think this was not started, so I'll put that in my speech marks and press enter. Okay, we could even, if you wanted to, because we've written not started there, we could actually remove that text and just reference that cell, and Excel will say, okay, well, if the contents of the cell it's looking at is equal to whatever's in Q5, which is not started, then it will return the number of not started tasks. And we can drag that function down, copy it down, and because I've referenced the cell, I don't have to change my function because this one's referencing Q6 in progress and this one's referencing Q7 complete. Okay, and we looked at relative referencing in the last session. Okay, so now I've got that and I've used my functions rather than just referencing a load of raw data. I can use this to create kind of a regular chart. So I can go to recommended charts, or I can choose one, and you'll see that they start to make a lot more sense. Yeah, so we could have a bar chart, we could have a pie chart. Let's just do a bar chart. So click OK. Okay, that's not a pivot chart. It's not created a pivot table. This is a regular chart, and I can pop this anywhere I want in my dashboard. Okay, now benefits of doing it that way. Obviously, it took me a few minutes to go in and create the functions. Benefits of doing it this way is that that chart will automatically update, okay, because it's linked to these live functions. So if I go into my work log and say, actually, that one's now complete and that one's complete as well, and I go to my dashboard, you should have seen it there, it's automatically updated. Okay, so advantages of using kind of your regular Excel charts over your pivot charts is that they do automatically update. Disadvantages, you will need to be kind of creating those functions yourself. Okay. When we create a chart and we select that chart, we have these additional options here on our ribbon. So we have chart design and we have our format. Chart design, we're looking at things like the chart elements, the layout, and the overall appearance of the chart. So at the minute, we have some grid lines, we have some labels, we have a title, which isn't brilliant. So obviously we can go in and change that. I'm not going to write it. I'm just going to put status, and obviously we can go in and change that color and so on. So you can do little edits to it. If you're looking in the chart design, the chart element drop down is quite nice because that's what allows you to select those different elements within the chart. So for example, at the minute I don't have an axis title, but if I selected primary horizontal, you can see in the preview there, it will allow me to put maybe status underneath. We've got things like, do I want the chart title? Do I want data labels? So that's where it puts the actual numbers, the actual values outside of those columns. Things like a legend, grid lines, trend lines. So you can go in and add and remove each of those. Or alternatively, they have these quick layouts, which just kind of add or remove some of those elements into these pre-built options. Our chart styles, again, we can see the benefit of setting up that theme right back on the first session because it's giving us our color scheme. So we've got those options for kind of the different appearance of the chart. And of course, we can go in and change the data that we're using or change the chart type if we want to. The format options is more for changing individual things. So rather than changing the overall design or the chart elements, we're saying actually we want this bar to be, you know, yellow, for example, and we can change those individual things if we want to. So those are all available in there if you have your chart selected. So we've got kind of a standard Excel chart, but what would happen if we added some pivot tables and pivot charts? So I'm going to go back to my my work log table. I'll go to insert, and then we've got two options here for pivot tables. So we can create a pivot table completely from scratch, so a blank pivot table that we go in and customize ourselves, or just like we had with that chart option, we can create recommended pivot tables as well. So again, really useful if you're not particularly confident with pivot tables. It's telling you the sorts of tables that you might want to create from this data. So again, sum of ID number is not one we really want. Sum of days remaining, maybe. These ones it's given me today are not particularly useful, but sometimes it gives you some good ones. Again, it might be, you know, number of tasks by status or number of tasks assigned to each individual. But as we can see, it is limited. So it's really good if you are able to create a pivot table from scratch, and then you can completely set it up the way that you want to. So I'll cancel that one and I'll go to pivot table. It's confirming the data or the range of data that we will be using for our pivot table. Notice again how it's automatically selected that whole table. So again, if I add any additional rows to that table, it is going to pick that up in our pivot table and pivot charts. Whereas if this data wasn't formatted as a table and it was just a cell range, so, you know, A1 to Z17 or something, suddenly if you have an A18, it's not going to automatically pick it up. So we've got that table there. I'm going to pop it in a new worksheet. I tend to pop pivot tables in a new worksheet because it just makes them a little bit easier to see. And we're also importantly going to tick this option at the bottom. We are going to add this data to the data model. Now, the benefit of that is going to come later on when we're creating multiple pivot tables and we're using multiple pivot charts and slices within our dashboard. It essentially means that all of those are going to be connected together in the same data model so that when we manipulate our dashboard, it affects everything. So we'll make sure we tick that one, click OK, and then it's going to generate a new worksheet, which I'm just going to rename PT so I know what it is. I'm going to move it along a little bit, and we've got our blank pivot table. This is a pivot table here, and then on the right hand side, when you have the pivot table selected, is when you can go in and start setting up your fields. If I don't click on the pivot table, so click on a random cell off to the side of it, that pivot table panel on the right side disappears. So you just need to make sure that that's selected so that you can see this here. If it ever disappears, you can click that field list as well. Sometimes if you accidentally close it, you don't know how to get it back. It's the field list at the top. So what we have in here, we can see it's drawing in data from our tracker table, and you'll notice that all of these are the columns that we have in our table. So things like who is assigned to, the status, the priority, the category, and so on. And with pivot tables, the idea is that we would drag and drop these into these areas underneath. So for example, if I drag a category into rows, then for each category, it will automatically create that into a row. So those are our categories: admin, delivery, and materials. We would always need something in categories, in columns and or rows, and we would also always need something in our values. Our values is the actual calculations. So if I drag category into values, for example, what it's going to do, and you can see there, it's going to count them. So it's counting how many tasks we have in our table for each of the categories. Now, that's essentially a bit like what we were doing with our count if. So it's done that for you. It's counting each of those and providing that answer on the right hand side. When you're creating pivot charts from your pivot table, so I know that I'm going to be creating a pivot chart in a minute, it's always recommended that you put your the things that you're going to be analysing into the rows area, because it's then going to be a lot easier when we make our charts. If you put it in columns, sometimes your charts start looking a bit odd. So put it into rows, and then obviously what we're calculating into the values. We're not going to go too much into detail into pivot tables today, but what you could do if you were kind of interested in generating more complicated pivot tables is you could put things into your columns as well. So we could say priority, and then that will make the priorities into columns. So you see now, rather than just analysing one thing, it's like our count ifs, isn't it? So it's looking at the category and it's also looking at the priority as well. It's counting those and it's giving us totals. So you can start playing around, putting in things, rows and your columns. And in the values area, you can, if it's kind of something that you're adding up or you're totaling, you can go into the value field settings and you can change it. So the count is perfect for this because I only want to count how many things there are. But if it was, for example, let's say something financial, so maybe you were looking at, I don't know, sales for each quarter or something like that, you could say, actually, I want it to be the sum, or I want it to be the average, for example, and you can change it in there. So there's quite a lot of things that you can easily change that, you know, if you were doing those functions and typing those functions in yourself, is going to take a lot more time and a lot more effort. Okay. So I'm going to take that one out just because we just want our rows and values, and I'm going to create a couple more so that we have some additional pivot charts as well. So go back to my work log, we'll do insert pivot table. We're going to put it in our existing worksheet and we're going to add it to the data model. Click OK. This one, let's do who it's assigned to. So again, I'll put it in the rows and then I'll put that also in the values. So again, it's counting how many tasks are assigned to each individual. We'll do one more. I want to do one with dates. So we'll do pivot table, existing worksheet, add it to the data model, and this time let's look at due date. So we'll drag that into rows and drag that into values. You'll notice when I drag that into rows, it's a little bit different. It's kind of split it. So with your pivot tables with dates, it's automatically grouped it by month, and I can then expand it and it will give individual dates. But obviously, normally, probably when you're interested in the month as a whole. Okay. When you create your pivot tables, again, when you have your pivot tables selected, we have two additional tabs that appear at the top here. Our design tab I'm not too worried about today because this is going to be kind of behind the scenes that people aren't going to see, so I'm not too worried about what they look like, but you can go in and change the colors and you know, if it's displaying the totals and things like that. In the Analyze tab, this is going to be really important for us. This is our pivot table name. So each of our pivot tables at the minute has just been given a very generic name, and I'm going to go in and change that because later on we're going to be referring to these by name. So I'm quickly going to put in, let's call this category PT. Going to click on this one. We're going to call this assigned to PT. And I'll click on this one and we will do due date PT. Okay. The other thing that we have in this pivot table analyze tab is a pivot chart button. So this is what will allow us to create a pivot chart from this pivot table. So I've clicked within this one. I'll click pivot chart and then we can go in and select the chart that we want to have. Let's make a pie chart from this one so we can see kind of the proportions quite nicely for the different tasks. So I'll click OK and then I'll just cut and paste that into my dashboard. There we go. Now it's now that you start to maybe see a couple of differences between our kind of standard Excel chart and our pivot chart. Okay. Let me just move that in a little bit there, and let's just change this. So what was this one? Category. Task by category. Again, we've still got the same options in the design and format, so we can still come in, and I'm going to remove that legend because it's using up a lot of space, and I'm going to add in those data labels instead. Let's do something like that. Obviously, you could play around with the fonts and the colors and things. Sometimes it lets you drag those out. There we go, something like that. Okay. You'll also notice we have this here. So when you create your pivot charts, you have these field buttons. Now that's not something that I want to see on here because I don't want people kind of touching them, playing around with them. So we can right click and we can just hide those buttons. Okay, and now it looks a little bit more like a regular chart. We do have an additional tab, so when we're clicking on our kind of regular charts, we've just got chart design format. When we're clicking on our pivot charts, we also have our pivot chart analyze. So that's where we'll be able to kind of add slices, which we'll do in a minute. And importantly, that's how we can refresh our data. So a huge difference between your standard charts and your pivot charts is that pivot charts, just like pivot tables, do not update automatically. So if I change my data, the status chart will update, as we saw a minute ago, but this pivot chart won't. So for our pivot tables, our pivot charts, we need to refresh them. So you can click the drop down and you can refresh just this one, or importantly, you can refresh all. So that's going to refresh all your pivot charts, all your pivot tables. Okay. We'll chat a little bit more later about kind of maybe the implications that would have on the workbook and some possible ways around it. But that's another difference that we would have between the two. So let's pop a couple more on here. So I'll go back to my pivot tables. We'll go to pivot table analyze, pivot chart. Let's just do a bar chart. I'm trying to make them look a little bit different from each other. And cut and paste. And again, I'm just going to just resize that a little bit, and I'm going to right click and just remove these and remove that one. And we're going to remove that legend as well if we don't really need that. None. There we go. Final one. So come back into here, pivot chart. And let's do. This one is dates. So I'm going to do this as a line chart because what I want to see is the amount of tasks over time. So we're going to do that as a line chart instead. So let's take that one, cut and paste it. And again, we'll hide all of those field buttons and we'll hide that legend as well. Legend and none. Okay. What you can do on your dashboard as well is you can go to view and you can turn off grid lines. Sometimes that looks a little bit nicer. You can hide obviously any functions or remove them if you. Oh, I didn't think that was going to do that. We'll leave that there. Obviously, like I said, in real life, you could put that on another worksheet. You don't have to have it here. And let's just close that. Okay, so it's starting. Obviously, you can play around with the colors and things like that, but it's starting to look a little bit more like a dashboard. Okay. We can also add slices. So with your dashboard, it's kind of thinking about what you want from it. Do you want it to just be a dashboard that people just view, or do you want it to be an interactive dashboard? Do you want it to be a dashboard where people go on and they can filter things and change their views on things? Again, that's not something that's possible with. It is possible, but it's a little bit more complicated with your standard Excel charts. But with your pivot charts, we can easily add slices and timelines that are user-friendly ways for individuals to go in and filter that data. So if I click on this pivot chart, for example, and I go to pivot chart analyze, we have the options here for slices and timelines. Now you may remember back in the first session, we actually added slices to our table here on the right hand side. So they allow users to click on these and easily filter the table rather than having to know how to use the Excel filters at the top. There's options obviously to remove the filters and also to multi-select if they had multiple things that they wanted to filter by. It's the same idea with your pivot charts, and you can do it with pivot tables as well if you've got those visible. So we're going into pivot chart analyze and we can insert a slicer. We can then choose what we want to filter by. So again, it's giving us, because it's all part of the same data model, it's giving us all of the different columns within that table. So let's say I want the ability to filter by category and by assigned to, and maybe by priority as well. So let's click OK. And that's going to generate 3 slices, which I'm just going to pop over here. I'm just going to resize them a little bit. And Let's do that. There we go. Now, these are going to work a bit like, I'm just going to move that out of the way, that's annoying me. Shove it over there. There we go. These are going to work a little bit like the slices we had for our table. So we're clicking on them and it's applying that filter. Now you'll notice that it's only applying the filter to that pivot chart that I selected. It's not filtering anything else. Okay. If you wanted slices which filtered all of those charts on your dashboard, then you would have to link them to those pivot charts. So if I click on my slicer here, I have this slice tab in the ribbon. And we've got things again like designs. Of course, you go and change the colors and things like that. You've got slicer settings, so you can change, for example, the header. So you could remove it, or you could put something like choose a category or whatever you wanted to change the text in there. You can also change how the items are sorted. So there's a few different options. The one I'm going to be looking at is report connections. So that is saying, okay, what is this slicer linking to? What is it going to affect? At the moment, it's linked to my category pivot table because that's the pivot chart that I selected, the category pivot chart. But you can see the other two pivot tables and therefore pivot charts are listed here as well. Okay, so that was the importance of connecting them all to the data model at the start, and also, as you can see, the importance of naming them as well, because if you did only want it to link to maybe one other one, it's going to be very hard to know which one that is if you haven't named it properly. So I'm going to link it to all of them. I'm going to click OK, and you'll notice now when I'm clicking on my options within that slicer, it is filtering all three of these tables. Like I mentioned before, it's not going to filter just any of your standard Excel charts if you have those. Okay, so let's do the same with these two underneath. So I'll select this one, report connections. Let's link it to the other two, and select this one, report connections, and link it to the other two in there. So now I can use a combination. As long as it applies to at least one thing, and we can see that it's filtering all of those. Okay, so that again is optional. It might not be something you want users to be able to do, but it's another option for your dashboard. Now, one big disadvantage, like I mentioned, is the idea of those pivot tables and pivot charts refreshing. So if I go in and add data, change data, remove data in my work log, it's not automatically going to update those pivot tables and the pivot charts. It's going to require someone to go into pivot chart analyze, go to refresh all to refresh them, or there is the keyboard shortcut Alt and F5. It's not particularly user friendly. There are a couple of options that we can do. We can go into if I go into my go back to my pivot table analyze. Here we are, options, and I go into my mind blank now. There we go. In the data tab, you can turn on refresh data when opening the file. So that just means that when someone opens the file, it would automatically refresh the data in the pivot table and pivot chart. So obviously it's not going to refresh it when they're in there unless they click the refresh button themselves, but at least we know that from that time of them opening the file, it would have refreshed for them. So that's one option. The other option is we could actually create a button that someone could click on, maybe at the top here, that when they click on it, it refreshes the data, because again, it's just a little bit more user friendly than people having to find the refresh button in there. To create a button, I'm going to go into my Automate tab. Now, if you've used Excel macros before or Visual Basic VBA, then you can use macros for this as well. However, more recently, Microsoft within 365 have added this automate tab within Excel, and it's kind of a user-friendly version of Excel macros because you can record the automations a bit like you could record a macro. But it's a little bit more user-friendly in terms of viewing that script, editing it, and adding that automation or that button into your workbook. So I'll go to automate, I'll go to new script, and I will click create from recording, and it opens up a panel on the right hand side, and in a minute it will tell us that it is recording. There we go. So now all I need to do is do the action. So I'm going to click on any of the charts, pivot chart analyze, and then refresh all. And on the right side, we'll see that updates. And this is something that makes it a lot bit more friendly than the macros. If you've seen macros before, you get kind of the lines of code and everything. It can look a little bit confusing. With this automation, it's rather than giving us code, it's just telling us what it's doing. It's refreshing all data connections in the workbook. Perfect. That's all we needed to do. Stop. And that's created our script. You can rename it if you want. I think I've already got a refresh data script from when I was playing around with this the other day, so I'm just going to call it 123. And then underneath, we have got the option to add it into our workbook. And that is going to, oh, I need to select a cell. That will add this button into here, okay? And I will just move it. You can, of course, change the text. Oh, it's hard to edit it without accidentally clicking on it. I'll just call it refresh. Of course, we have to have the kiss purple button. There we go. Okay, something like that. You might want to edit the shape so it looks a little bit more like a button, so people know it's a button rather than a. Anyway, we can play around with it. So people can click on that and it will refresh the data. Okay, so a lot easier than having to do it Alt F5 or clicking on that and clicking refresh. It's just a nice easy button there for them. Okay, so in terms of like, you know, the pivot chart versus a standard chart, it's really up to you and what you want. If you want ease of use but you're willing to kind of create all of those functions yourself, and perhaps you're not interested in having people using slices and things like that, I'd definitely say just stick with your standard Excel charts. But if you want more of an interactive dashboard, you want those slices, and perhaps in terms of setting them up, you just want something quick and easy like a pivot table, then I'd definitely take the pivot chart route. So final thing I want to do is just add some worksheet and workbook protection to my file so that when people are looking at it, then they're not going to go in and change things that they don't need to. This, of course, is another optional step. You don't have to do this. I guess it depends how much you trust the people you work with. But things like these, so I mean, I would definitely hide these at the very minimum. So we can right click and we can hide these worksheets. With the pivot table worksheet, I am just going to hide it. I'm not going to add any protection to that sheet, just because if you start adding protection to pivot table sheets, sometimes it can stop them refreshing. So we'll just hide that away. With our XLOOKUP and our lookups, we can add protection to those sheets. So right click, protect sheet, and all it's going to allow people to do if they do unhide the worksheet is they can just select the cells. It's not going to allow them to edit them. It's not going to allow them to format them or insert rows or anything like that. The password protection is optional. So in theory, you could protect the sheet without password protection, but then all someone has to do is right click, unprotect, and it's available again. So I'd recommend using a password in there and then re-enter it. Obviously you have to remember the password, and now it's protected, so I can right click and hide. Okay, same with this one, right click, protect sheet, pop in a password, and then if someone did want to unprotect it or someone tried to edit it, so if I try and edit it now, I'm just getting this error message. They would have to go to unprotect sheet and type in the password and then hide. Okay, With our work log, obviously we don't want to hide the sheet, we want people to be able to see it, but we do just want to make sure, possibly you want to make sure that people can't edit certain cells or do certain things. So for kind of protecting individual cells within a sheet, you have to, this almost sounds a bit backwards, you have to select the cell that you want people to be able to edit. So most of the table I want people to be able to edit, but if you remember, there were, where were they? Things like this one, days remaining. So this one is a function. It's calculated automatically. So maybe I don't want people editing that particular cell. So you can go in and select the cells that you do want them to be able to edit. We can go to Format, and at the minute it's got that lock cell selected. I would tick that, and essentially that will unlock those cells. And then when I apply the sheet protection, I can then also tick the things I want them to be able to do. So I do want them to be able to, let's say, insert rows, and I want them to be able to sort, and want them to be able to filter, but maybe I don't want them to delete columns and things like that. And it's also going to protect those locked cells. So any cells I didn't select, they're not going to be able to edit. And again, we can protect it like that. With your dashboard, where you've got things like objects like charts and things like that, we can right click and then the format chart area. I'm trying to remember where it is now. No, it's the slices. That's what it is, because they're going to be clicking on the slices. There it is, size and properties, and we can go into properties, and then we can untick that locked option. So people will be able to edit those slices when we protect the sheet, but they won't be able to, you know, delete the chart, for example. So yeah, if you want them to be able to use anything in here, we just need to make sure that they're not locked. And again, when we go into our sheet protection, we just need to make sure that anything you do want them to be able to do, so things like allowing that so that we can refresh, then we can tick those, and again apply that sheet protection. Okay, so again, it's an optional thing, but it might just allow you to have that little bit more control over what people are able to edit. You can protect your overall workbook as well. So obviously we have things like your password protection, which you may have used before. It's the same like if you protect a Word document. So you're putting in a password. When people open it, they have to put the password in. But this one here, so protect workbook structure, is protecting unwanted changes to the structure of the workbook as a whole. So we use the worksheet protection, and we were protecting individual cells or seeing what people could and couldn't do. But this time we're looking at the workbook structure as a whole. So we're saying, actually, you're not going to be able to go in and add worksheets or delete worksheets or unhide worksheets. So we can apply that as well. So there's lots of options for protecting your workbook. At that point, you would then upload it to a shared location. So that could be SharePoint or Teams. And then obviously the advantage of that is everyone can open it and they can co-author. They can edit it at the same time. Just make sure that if you do have a refresh button on your dashboard, in order for people to be able to use that, they need to make sure that they are opening that Excel file within the Excel application. So I'm sure you've seen it before. If you open something from Teams or SharePoint or OneDrive, sometimes it opens in your browser. And a lot of the time, everything works absolutely fine. It's a little bit more of a limited view, but everything works fine. If you want to use that refresh button, so if you want to use those scripts within Excel, you need to make sure that people are opening it in the actual Excel application. So using that option within Teams or SharePoint to open it in the application rather than in the web. Okay, so popping back to our presentation. So next steps, like I said, saving the template, making sure we're saving it to the cloud, so SharePoint, Teams, and that means that we can have that co-authoring, so people are able to go into that tracker at the same time and add and edit those items. When we're using the template, like I mentioned, we need to make sure if we do have the refresh button and the slicers as well, that's the other thing. If you have those, we're opening it within our Excel application rather than your browser. Further actions, I see this so many times. People create an Excel file and they stick it somewhere and they go, everyone go and use it. It's great. It works really well. And there's no training or additional communication, and then the whole thing falls down and people don't like it, and then they try and mess around with it, or they just stop using it completely because they don't understand it. It's not doing exactly what they want. So make sure there's that training piece around it so people know how it works. Make sure that you're encouraging feedback so that, you know, if it's not working for people, they need to be able to let you know so that you can amend it, and continually make improvements and updates. You know, something like this is not something that you would make once and then it would be perfect for the next 5 years. Like, there's always going to be things that you can go in and change and update, and that's normal and that's absolutely fine. Is Excel always the answer? So we've made this tracker, we've made this dashboard. Is there going to be any disadvantages of using it? The advantages, it was, I know it's taken us 3 sessions, but obviously that's with me chatting. If you were sat there doing it on your own, it is quite a quick and easy thing to set up and to edit if anything needs changing. It works immediately. You can create something like this and you can stick it on Teams or SharePoint, and in theory people go in and start working on it straight away. It's not using a separate system, or I'm not asking IT to set something up or looking for approval or anything like that. It's pretty much ready to go as soon as I've created it. When we're saving it in the cloud, we're getting the benefits from that. So that co-authoring, and you do have version history as well. So with co-authoring, when people start making changes in the document, Excel will automatically save or begin regularly saving as new versions. So you can go back to older versions if there's some kind of error or someone makes a big mistake. What are the disadvantages? It's not foolproof. So yes, we added, you know, the drop downs, the data validation, and we added that workbook protection, but someone could still go in there and put in some inconsistent data. They might find ways around it. They could maybe accidentally delete something or overwrite something that was there before. So it's certainly not going to get rid of, you know, any potential errors. There's not a full audit trail. So although we have the version history, we can't go in and say, Sally edited this cell at this time and she changed it from this to this. Okay, so we've got something, but it's not, again, it's not full, it's not perfect. In theory, probably what the situation would be is that the workbook would be created and therefore managed by a single person. So it might be me that created the workbook, and any changes in the future would come back to me, which I'm very happy to do when I'm in the office. But what happens if I'm on annual leave? What happens if I'm off sick? What happens if I leave the business? Who's going to look after it then? So again, there's that. Obviously, you can get around it maybe if there's other people that are able to work it, but there is that potential that if you've got one person looking after it, it could fall down if something happens. Really, what we need to look at in terms of whether you're using Excel for these sorts of files is what the situation is. So if you're looking at your green spreadsheets, Excel is fine. So personal analysis for Excel, yeah, your own little workbook that you're using and you're just doing your own, you know, calculations and things like that, fine. Ad hoc modeling, so it's a one-off. We're going in there, we're creating a spreadsheet, and it's just a one-off, or one-off scenarios. In that amber area, sometimes Excel can be brilliant, and sometimes it's not going to work as well. So share tracker is exactly what we've created. What we've created would work brilliantly in a small team. You know, there's going to be a few people going into it every day and updating it. And that's fine. That's all we need, and we don't need a full audit trail for a work tracker, so that's not a problem. But if you had a very, very large team, or you were working on work items, it was really, really important that we have an audit trail. And actually, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's client-based work, and actually if something happens, we need to go back and know exactly what happened on that date. in order to be able to tell the client, for example, then it's not going to work as well. So yeah, like collaboration, not too many users, simple data, nothing that's really important data, and also no requirements for larger workflows. We'll chat about workflows in a minute, but with that tracker, I didn't need kind of approval workflows or anything like that. It was just a table and some pivot charts. Red on the right hand side, time to escape. So Excel is not really the ideal solution if you're looking at things like compliance registers. It's really important data. We need to have a full audit trail. Yeah, Excel's not going to work very well. Matter management, so looking at specific matters, pieces of work that we need to be able to track really well, and also client data storage, so using tables and things to store client data. Again, it's so easy to overwrite or accidentally edit. Excel it's not ideal. So if we were looking at those examples in the red area, or some of those examples in the orange area that weren't going to work in Excel, what's the alternative? What can we do? Obviously, you might have other applications, specific applications that you can use for those things, in which case brilliant. But if you are looking for other alternatives, specifically within your Microsoft 365 environment, there are many apps that we can use. SharePoint. So SharePoint, you might have seen or you might use. It's brilliant for files. It's great as like an intranet, creating intranets and kind of communication sites, but can also be used for storing tables of data, and they're referred to as SharePoint lists. SharePoint list, you have that full audit trail, so you can see for each individual item within the list who's gone in and changed it, what date, what time, and what they've changed. You still have that version history as well. You have access logging, and also you can set specific permissions. So you can say this person can go in and edit this person can only read it, and there's a little bit easier to control those permissions than within Excel. It also stores data in defined fields. So looking at SharePoint lists just on the surface, it's going to look a little bit like an Excel table. You've got your columns and your rows, but actually behind the scenes, those columns of data, the data validation is a lot more advanced. So you can do things like this column is going to contain pictures, okay, which you can't do in Excel. We can, but you can't specifically say this column is for pictures. And you can do things like notes. You can add, there's an option called append notes, which means that rather than accidentally overwriting a note within a cell like you would in Excel, it just continues to add. So anytime you add a note, it keeps all of the old notes and it just adds yours at the bottom without overwriting any of the previous notes. So there's lots and lots of options in SharePoint lists. Power Apps. So with Power Apps, you can actually build very simple kind of no code or low code apps, and you can use that for your data entry. So instead of people going into Excel, you could say, you know what, use this app, and the app is really going to be locked down so that people can only type in certain fields, and then that app would then feed into Excel or into SharePoint lists. So again, it's going to reduce the risk of users actually going into a spreadsheet and accidentally breaking it, and a lot of people would find it more user-friendly to go in and load something which looks a bit like a website and enter it in there. Power BI is used for reporting. It is an additional license. If you only have kind of your basic 365 license, you would need an additional license for Power BI, but it's kind of charts and analysis and things like that. And Power Automate, which we've covered in our sessions before, we can use that for workflows. So if you're interested in storing data, but then you want workflows off the back of that, so you want maybe an approval process, maybe you want notifications, like I want to receive an email when someone updates this, or I need you to send a Teams message to all of the members of this team to tell them when this happens, then we can do that within Power Automate. And you can combine them. So we could have a SharePoint list that links to an app that links to Power BI and runs approvals through Power Automate. So you can combine one or more of them together. If you are interested in those topics, watch this space. So our next webinar, which is in a few weeks' time, is going to be on SharePoint lists. So if you're interested in seeing how those work and kind of comparing those to Excel, that's a topic we'll be looking at next.